Hey folks, I promise the title's not clickbait. Kingshot developers are actually lying to us about how combat really works. For example, did you know that these stats that you see on each and every troop type are not used at all in the game? They're purely cosmetic. For more details on this and other surprising finds, stick around for the full video. But first things first, let me share how we can possibly know that the devs are lying to us when they're describing combat, and why that's not necessarily a bad thing. When I posted my guide to Kingshot Combat, linked below in the description, I mentioned that I would provide updates if our current understanding of the game evolved. And it has quite a bit. There's still a lot of value in that video, and I recommend you watch it since this video builds on it in some ways. But here's what actually happened. The code of a game with a similar lineage became publicly available. You see, Century Games, the publisher of Kingshot and Whiteout Survival, used to be part of Fun Plus before being sold to a separate holding company. After that, it served as a publisher for another Fun Plus subsidiary, Kings Group, and you may know them as a creator of strategy games like King of Avalon and State of Survival. Due to this shared lineage, there are a number of similarities in the back-end code of these games with Whiteout Survival and Kingshot. Well, State of Survival has much more publicly available information about how its battle simulation works, and you can read much more about it at the link below in the description. Using this information, Frack, of the Frackinator website, also linked below in the description, has spent an inordinate amount of time coding the logic of this into a simulator and testing it against in-game battle reports to figure out which code aspects are applicable to Kingshot and which are not. After much work, he's been able to accurately predict battle outcomes based on stats input into the resulting code down to the individual troops remaining when chance-based hero and troop abilities are removed. And this confirms that we are accurately modeling all of the underlying mechanics, and it is very different than the narrative that Kingshot publicly says about itself. Before I get into exactly how Kingshot is different under the hood, I do want to level set about how this sort of obfuscation is actually quite common in games, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. If you spent any time studying game design, you'll find examples of games explicitly lying to players, and many times for good reason. If you've ever played tactical RPGs like XCOM, you might be surprised to know that the percent hit rates of attacks are frequently inflated in favor of the players in secret. This is because if you have millions of players each doing thousands of attacks, a large portion of them will experience the 1 in 100,000 chance of missing 5 consecutive 90% attacks. This leads to frustrated players who might quit and sometimes even waste developer time with erroneous bug reports. And game development is rife with examples of developers making trade-offs between how a game is presented to the player versus how it works under the hood for all sorts of user experience and technical reasons. So we shouldn't expect something different here. However, I think it's important for you to know how to make the smartest investment decisions for you and your alliance. And speaking of smarter investment decisions, special thanks to the Play Smarter community who've made a way for serious spenders to invest smarter and support my channel leveraging your in-game spend with creator code SLOTH at checkout. If you want a trustworthy concierge-like approach to spending that follows you from game to game, follow the link below in the description for details. So let's talk about the actual lies the developers are telling us about combat, and we'll start off with that one about the troop stats. When you go into your barracks, you will see these stats, and they're different between different troop types, as well as different tiers of troops. And the idea is that they'll improve as you increase your troop tier levels as well as true gold levels. Unfortunately, they are completely made up. And if you didn't know these were made up, you might come to some erroneous conclusions based on analyzing them. For example, I've heard arguments that infantry damage dealing capabilities start to catch up to other troop types later in the game. This is because the difference between a rookie infantry's 1 attack is only 20% of a rookie archer's 5 attack. Meanwhile, a true gold level 4 tier 11 infantry's 15 attack is 71% of a true gold 4 tier 11 archer's attack. I've also heard an argument that unlocking tier 11 troops is really not that good of a value because the stats only go up 1 or 2 each when you move up the tier level. Meanwhile, you could use that same amount of true gold to go up more true gold levels and get even higher stats. But the problem is both of these arguments are based entirely on flawed data. So what do troop numbers really look like? Well, it's a bit surprising. A tier 1 infantry actually has 63 attack and 10 lethality, as well as 189 health and 10 defense. Compare this to a tier 1 archer who has 252 attack and 10 lethality, as well as 47 health and 10 defense. And if you promote that tier 1 infantry to a tier 10 infantry, his new stats become 472 attack, 10 lethality, 1,416 health, and 10 defense. While a tier 10 archer gets 1,888 attack, 10 lethality, 354 health, and 10 defense. So a couple of things become immediately apparent. The infantry attack is always 25% of the archer attack, which means that infantry never actually catch up in damage dealing capacity at higher tiers. Also, and perhaps the one that jumped out to you even more so, is the lethality and defense are always equal to 10. In fact, this is true for all troop types at all tiers and all true gold levels that we have observed. And this may be a little bit surprising at first that these numbers don't really change when you move from tier to tier or troop type to troop type, and I'll get into that in a moment when we talk about combat stats and the damage formula overall. But in short, when we plug these numbers into the simulator we built, we can predict the battle outcome in game down to a single troop death. If we use the numbers shown in the barracks, the battle simulation actually falls apart. The source we found for State of Survival gives a full data table of the troop stats, and we've been able to confirm almost all of them in Kingshot, except for a couple of odd combinations like Tier 6 True Gold 5, which seem to be erroneous, or new True Gold levels 6 through 8, which are not available in the source data. Brack and I will continue to test and confirm the Kingshot combinations as we build out the simulator, but many troop tiers and levels introduce random chance abilities which make us require a high-intensity number of battles to fit against an expected distribution curve. Okay, but you're still probably wondering what is up with those stats that I just showed, and what do they actually do? And that brings us to lie number 2. If you send in a question to Kingshot support asking about the role of stats like attack, defense, health, and lethality in combat simulation, you'll get a response like this one. In short, it says that lethality deals damage directly to enemy health, defense reduces this impact but can be offset with attack to penetrate enemy defenses. And this is what I said was our current understanding in my prior combat video because, again, it's confirmed by Kingshot's developers. But bluntly, this is not true at all. So here's how it really works. There are 2 offensive stats named attack and lethality that are otherwise identical. They might as well be called Offense 1 and Offense 2. Then there are 2 defensive stats that are named Defense and Health that are otherwise identical, just like how the 2 offensive stats are related to each other. There is a larger and more complex combat formula that brings all of these things together, but in simplistic terms, your relevant troop attack and lethality stats get multiplied by your overall account attack and lethality stat bonuses respective for that troop type. These are then multiplied together to create your damage output for that turn of attack for that troop type. Then a similar thing happens with your opponent's troops being targeted by the attack, only instead it multiplies the relevant troops' defense and health stats by your opponent's overall account bonuses respective for that troop type. You can think of this as your opponent's ability to resist damage. Then you simply take your damage output and divide it by the enemy's ability to resist damage. And this forms the basis for the amount of troops you defeat in the attack. The result gets further multiplied in the formula relating to number of troops involved and hero skills, but we'll get into that in a moment. Also, because that base troop defense and lethality are always equal to 10 no matter the tier or type, they essentially cancel each other out in this formula, which further reduces the complexity. Also, I should give credit where it is due to Daryl over at the Kingshot Data and Kingshot Guides websites for being the first I'm aware of to report out this simplified formula some months back and then do some iterations on it. And I'm glad that we've been able to independently verify it from our end. But let's quickly talk about the implications of all of this for building your account. It means we now know that lethality isn't always better than attack, and health isn't always better than defense. And here, Kingshot Support's response is actually truthful when it says generally a balance between the 2 is needed to maximize your combat efficiency. It's just not true that adjusting the ratio flexibly against different opponents will help you achieve better results. Now obviously you want those stats to be as high as possible, but the more balanced your offensive stats are, and the more balanced your defensive stats are, the better the resulting outcome will be. This is because of the multiplicative relationship they have with each other in the combat formula. In simplistic terms, 10 times 10 will give you a greater result than 9 times 11, 8 times 12, 1 times 19, or any other way you could possibly allocate 20 stat points. So the takeaway is the most valuable offensive stat is the one you currently have less of, which may frequently be lethality but not always. And similarly, the most valuable defensive stat is the one you currently have less of, which may frequently be health, but not always. So invest accordingly. And our next slide comes to us courtesy of Kingshot's frequently asked questions page about combat, specifically the parts relating to battle process and target selection. This page says that each turn sees both sides selecting targets and attacking simultaneously, and when the front row is eliminated, troops target the next row. And in fairness, these are probably true enough for a high-level description. However, there are some wrinkles to this. This description of both sides selecting targets and attacking simultaneously is insufficient. What actually happens is that all three troop types select targets at the beginning of a round of combat, and the attacks are indeed launched simultaneously, but they are resolved sequentially. First, infantry from both sides have their damage calculated and resolved simultaneously and kills counted. Only after this do both sides' cavalry register their damage simultaneously. And finally, both sides' archers' attacks resolve simultaneously. And this, coupled with targets being set simultaneously at the beginning of a round of combat, can lead to some interesting outcomes. For example, if there was a hypothetical situation where your infantry defeated the last of the opposing infantry, you might expect your cavalry or archers to target the enemy's cavalry next, given this description here about the troop positioning taking place in different rows. However, this retargeting doesn't actually happen until the next turn of combat, meaning that your cavalry and archers will essentially be wasting their attack in this hypothetical turn, attacking the infantry that are already dead. And this is why you see some quick battles end without archers or even cavalry receiving any kills despite multiple rounds of combat taking place, such as with Viking Vengeance or a beast that you significantly outlevel. And unfortunately, there's not too much you can do about this, and it does impact both sides evenly. However, the implication is that cavalry would actually have a slight advantage over archers in this sort of edge case because they have the ability to occasionally bypass the infantry in their target selection phase and attack the enemy archers in the same round that the infantry are defeated. Meanwhile, archers could potentially forfeit their attack on the round enemy infantry are defeated and again on the round that enemy cavalry are defeated. So as we continue to build out our simulator to identify ideal troop compositions, these sort of hidden battle mechanics will need to be taken into account, but that's for a future video. Lie number 4 is about troop count, and this one is a lie of omission. The game gives the appearance that when you send 150,000 troops into battle, that you would actually get the benefit of all 150,000 troops participating in the battle, or at least fighting equally effectively. But this isn't the case either. This is because part of the damage formula also involves diminishing returns on troops. Essentially, the damage output you deal gets multiplied by the square root of the number of troops dealing that damage. You can interpret this as either not all troops participating in the attack, or that each subsequent troop participating has diminishing returns. Either way, the implication is that the later in the game you are, and the higher your squad or rally size already is, the less incremental benefit you will receive for your combat ability due to these diminishing returns. For example, if you were to double the amount of troops in your march, you only increase damage output by about 40%. And this slightly tilts the value in favor of pursuing stat gain bonuses over troop capacity bonuses later in the game. Another interesting troop-based modifier of the combat formula is that the damage in each round is multiplied by the square root of the minimum of the total troops you brought into battle or the total troops your opponent brought to battle. And this same value applies to both players for every single round of the attack. It doesn't really advantage one player or another, it simply speeds up the battle for bigger armies, so I won't go into more detail on this one. And the next lie is about hero skills. If you look at a skill like Chenko's Stand of Arms that says it increases all troops' lethality by 25%, and then you look at Rosa's Perihelion ability which also raises all troop lethality by up to 15%, you would reasonably expect these two skills to work in the same way, but they do not. And no, I'm not talking about how this widget skill only works on offense despite defensive garrisons still being called rallies in-game. You can learn more about the unique ways in which widget abilities actually get triggered in my guide to how widgets actually work, linked below in the description. Here I'm talking more about the combat formula, because these two abilities work in very different places. For the widget ability in question, it has a multiplicative effect on top of your total additive bonuses for lethality. It shows up as a special bonus in the battle report, and the resulting stats are increased by the relevant amount and reported back to you. And quick side note here, In my original combat guide, I said this has both an additive and multiplicative component and showed the math, which is technically true. However, a simpler way to explain it is that the battle report stats have an assumed 100% base value in them not shown. Sort of like if you say the price of something went up by 100%, then it doubled, and if it went up by 200%, it tripled. So that means that a plus 200% lethality in your battle report is really a tripling of your lethality output, and thus a 15% lethality special bonus would increase the stat by a plus 45% in the battle report as written. So hopefully this makes the multiplication of the special bonuses a little bit simpler to conceptualize. However, you may have noticed that abilities like Chenko's do not impact the battle report stats despite having a nearly identical skill description. They actually only show up in the battle report details as being active. And this is because they impact the combat formula in a different spot. There's actually a hero skill modifier that incorporates all active hero skills for that attack, including rally joiners. Now there's a lot of edge cases here that I'll probably go into in a future video, but the short version is that all damage boosting skills go into the numerator, and all of the defender's relevant damage resistance boosting skills go into the denominator. And this is true whether the skill claims to boost lethality, attack, or just straight up damage. And in fact, it's actually better to mix and match different skill descriptions because skills that have the same description are likely to have the same skill code in the game. This means that two lethality boosting skills of 25% each will add together to provide a 50% damage increase, whereas a 25% lethality and a 25% attack skill will multiply by each other directly, resulting in a roughly 56% damage increase. This also means that damage resisting skills like Gordon's 25% health ability are straight up better than Howard's 20% damage reduction. Despite the wording of the latter, which might make you think it multiplies damage dealt by 80%, it actually works by simply applying a 1.2 multiplier to the denominator, just like Gordon's skill, except his has a 1.25 multiplier at max skill level. And again, there's a lot more detail I could go into regarding hero abilities because there's some strange ones out there, but this isn't meant to be an exhaustive video on battle mechanics, just 5 things you should be aware of that work very differently than Kingshot developers say. And if you want one bonus lie, check out my video on combat ratings called Winning Unwinnable Battles linked below in the description. Keep an eye out for more videos in the future on this combat topic, especially as we're doing further combat validation and continuing to build out a more robust simulator to test out some of the combat myths. So feel free to leave things you would like us to test going forward in the comments below. And a special thank you to all of my Slot Squad channel members whose continued support helps make videos like this possible. I really appreciate you going on this journey with me. And be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay up to date with the latest Kingshot content. Thanks again for watching, and happy gaming out there.